Chapter 1. From the Novum Codex, Danubian translation, the Book of Bill, Chapter 3. And lo, the ancient nemesis still lived, hidden from sight of all who would oppose them, beyond time and beyond space itself, beyond mind and memory, beyond reach. We were blind, especially me, but then we saw. And from the original recording,
I thought we got rid of them pesky little buggers for good.
Another universe in another time. For clarity, another time in this context doesn't mean what you're probably thinking it means. It doesn't mean the same thing as a long time ago, or in eons past, or even in days of yore, or any of the other overly melodramatic descriptions of antiquity used to begin the sagas of times gone by. Technically, it is another time, that's true, but it runs concurrently with all the other times throughout the cosmos. Another time, but not at another time, if you get my drift. This particular universe, let's call it Universe X, is a young one, only just over 500 years old, which would hardly be worth mentioning, cosmoically speaking, if it weren't for the fact that it isn't quite entirely true. It's about 500 years old, and simultaneously about 50 billion years old. It depends on which end you're looking at it from. Unlike all the others, Universe X has a very specific function. The rest of them, the natural ones like the one we live in, are manifestations of physical laws so complex that we puny humans can't even start to approach the beginning of the commencement of the process of tentatively comprehending them one day. Universes might have a purpose for all we know, but trying to figure out what that purpose actually is has traditionally led the thinkers of such profound thoughts down some very narrow alleys in the past. Dangerously narrow, sometimes quite dark alleys. When it comes to understanding universes, we are as bacteria living in the gut of a maggot who is trying to comprehend the meaning of the weak dead badger it's living in. Analogies concerning an electron in an atom of a molecule that is part of the nucleus of a cell that is an integral part of the light receptor of an eyeball of a being who is sitting in a field looking into the night sky of his home planet and wondering what all the twinkly little lights are for, are not adequate enough to describe how far beyond us it is. But it isn't beyond the creators of this new artificial universe. They've had a few billion years longer than humanity to sort out the finer points of their versions of things like quantum electrodynamics, string theory, M theory, relativity and the like. It's kindergarten stuff to them. They know how it all works. In fact, they know it so well that they've gone so far as to take that knowledge to the ultimate extreme by using it to create their very own mini-universette here on the outskirts of town. They are not, however, and despite what you may have heard about how universes are normally created, gods. Godlike in their powers, certainly, but not gods. Gods usually only create universes for the sole purpose of generating life forms that will eventually grow up to build gold-plated temples dedicated to them, which isn't at all what's happening in this case. Quite the opposite, in fact. And for the same sort of reason you might want to move house if your current home was infested with rats. It's a pity all their effort is for naught, though, because in reality, or whatever passes for reality out here, these universe builders are actually the last surviving members of an ancient species from a different universe entirely, and they shouldn't even exist any longer, but they don't know that yet. Their basic problem, the one they don't know they have, is caused by the fact that universes are mutually exclusive. What happens in Universe X stays in Universe X, and vice versa. The fact that back home in Universe A their species has been eliminated from history due to a paradox-causing time travel trip made by a small group of their human nemesis who managed to escape their diabolical machinations and wipe out their species 6 billion years in the past, has escaped them, just as they have escaped it. I wish you could see the looks on their faces when they find out. Well, I say faces. The sub-prefect of darker matter accumulation nodes, Spodman, or Effin to his friends, looked down dejectedly at his primary pseudopod, which was busy, as it almost always was these days now the project was so close to completion. With one of his secondary pseudopodia he scratched at the annoyingly persistent itch on his thoracic signalling patch, which wasn't responding to the cream. "Farking reports," he muttered to himself for the 7th time today. It was one of those shifts. The kind that made him want to jack it all in, grow his antennae long, stop washing his spacesuit and buy a dinky little star wagon with a trailer. He could live quite happily just pootling around in a little ship. It'd be great. Planet hopping. No more responsibilities, no more pointless reports to fill in. He could paint it in bright colours and everything. Except it was impossible, of course. For now, anyway. Maybe it was something to consider when he finally got back home, which hopefully wouldn't be long now. It was a fantasy he often indulged in during his wearisome shifts at the data station. After all, he had more than 500 years back pay to collect, so affording it wouldn't be a problem. He also often wondered if fantasizing about making another life for himself when he finally did return to his home universe made him a bit peculiar, and he decided before long that it very probably did. Not that it mattered much, of course. This place was full of scientists. Peculiarity was normal. An agonized grunt spluttered from him as another one of the weird spasms he kept getting sent a sliver of hot pain through his second renal bivalve. They didn't last long, but they sure were sharp when they hit. Sharp enough to cause him to accidentally thump the floor of his pod unit with his dorsal perambulator, as just for a moment the spasm made him go rigid. He hated this part of his job, and he was convinced that the room he was forced to do it in was itself in some way contributing to his chronic antennae droop, which was only getting worse by the decade, despite the tablets. It was all he could do not to slime in frustration on occasion. Everyone complained about it. Even his good friend Basser thought this place was a dump hole, and Basser was usually so upbeat about everything. Effin was certain now that the dry air from the data station pod's ventilation duct was responsible for the breathing problems he started suffering from. He was convinced that he'd developed full-blown asthma, if that isn't a contradiction in terms, but it only seemed to be affecting 3 of his lungs, which was odd. Perhaps it was... No, he didn't want to think about that possibility. It was asthma, plain and simple. He breathed in deeply for a moment, checking the functioning of his 4th lung. It was still working fine for now. When he breathed out again, the sound was remarkably sigh-like. There was silence for a moment as he absent-mindedly rubbed some more cream into his itchy signalling patch. "Farking place," he muttered again, dreaming longingly of the end of his interminable shift. He was a scientist, for Pog's sake, not a data entry clerk. With less enthusiasm than an embarrassed dog walker bending down in the park with a flimsy plastic bag in his hand, he leaned over to pick up his input pad in order to start entering data for the thrice-daily report that would inform his immediate superiors, who would then inform their immediate superiors, and so on, that everything scheduled was still on schedule, that no inventory errors had been detected, that power output was, of course, optimum, and that there were, as usual, no anomalous occurrences of any kind whatsoever. The task took less than 3% of his brain power, but more than 30% of his time. Some of the rest of his brain power had provided him with the opinion that if they'd spent less time filling in pointless reports and more on the actual project itself, then they could easily have been back in their home universe by now, instead of still being stuck here in what was effectively a prison, the confinement of which had sent Effin so stir-crazy he'd bent the spoon. More than 500 years of isolation in a cramped space station in an empty universe, with no one to talk to but the 1,000 or so scientists trapped in there with you, can certainly do that to a person, whatever species you're from. And it wasn't just Effin and Basser. The cabin fever was playing havoc with morale amongst the crew in general, that much was obvious. Or at least it was now they knew what the word meant. Morale was a new word, unheard of back home, where morale was supposedly good, and it was suggested to the station's Regent Imperius by a particularly observant underling to describe the strangely uncooperative mood amongst the crew, not to mention the staff, because nobody ever mentions the staff. The Regent Imperius had approved the word for immediate use, and because morale was currently bad, he codified it in his characteristically vague manner as a deficiency of order due to a less than optimal attitude that must be corrected immediately. Strangely, this was not good for morale. Not a day had passed since then when Effin hadn't heard the new word being bandied around by all the depressed anti-dark matter designers and all the disgruntled hyperspatial trigonometrists as they chatted around the dihydrogen monoxide dispenser in the radiation lounge. It was almost a buzzword now. The major bugbear with most of the teams on the project, the one that really drove them through the sanity barrier, was that the new universe could have been completed 100 years ago had not Cool, the chief operating officer of logistics, required right from the outset that meticulous records be kept of absolutely bloody everything, even when there was no actual thing to record, like today, and most other days now we came to think about it. Whatever day meant out here in the middle of nowhere, obviously. They hadn't even got proper stars at this end of time, just formless plasma clouds waiting to cool down enough to form atoms. So it was all out of sync with days and nights these days, or something. Still, never mind. The time was finally nearly right. One more trip up to plus 50 billion years should confirm the latest adjustments by UFAT, the Universal Fine Adjustment Team. The new universe was almost certainly finished now, apart from a spot of polishing, and they could at last start thinking about going home again. As heroes, hopefully. The most recent test had been the best one yet. Just about right, in fact. The uptime teams had reported nothing more than a few simple microbes had evolved by plus 50 billion, and even though the stellar masses were lighting up the place nicely and the planets had plenty of carbon and water and stuff, it was an empty universe far into the future, free of all the pesky life forms that infested their dilapidated old home universe. And that, in turn, meant Effin could finally, thankfully, after all this time basically sweeping up and making the tea, start getting on with his primary job of sorting out the even darker matter bridge back home. The thought sent an anticipatory shiver of excitement through his lateral ventricles, as it always did when he thought about the prospect. The problem for Effin was that his particular expertise in even darker matter accumulation mathematics had only been required right at the start of the project, half a millennium ago when they first created the place. From then on, the ordinary dark matter boys had handled the universe itself. All he'd needed to do was tell them where to put it all. They were the builders, he was an architect, and he'd been bored out of his brain case ever since. But now, on the brink of the end of their endeavour, he would finally be needed again to ensure they could all go home. The time, his time, was just around the corner. Okay, so it's the corner of a tesseract, but it's still a corner. He was going home, and he was really, really looking forward to it. He missed his soap operas like anything. As he finished filling in the tedious and totally unnecessary report, his attentionizer flashed at him, annoyingly as always. A communique from the Uptime Stellar Holographic Information Team, USHIT, required his immediate attention. He skim-read it without interest and responded automatically with the nodal data they required. A monkey could have done it, but they'd run out of monkeys. Scratching furiously at his itchy signalling patch, he leaned back in his pod unit, closed all 5 of his tired visual receptors, stretched his lateral pseudopodia to relieve the cramp that was building up in his anterior-posterior, and sighed through both of his mouths. There were still another 20 segments of this shift left to complete, so it would be at least another half an hour before he could get back to his quarters and relax with his hobby. Everyone needs a hobby. Effin's was called fiction, and he'd picked it up during his last posting, over 500 years ago, inside an engineered moon orbiting a planet in a system called Sol. The memories started flooding back. It was better than filling in another report, so he let them. Sol had been such an easy posting, watching the possible Earth futures unfold on the chronosphere all day and reporting on the probabilities to Pratt, the Provost Regent of Alpha Team. It had been a simple job, even entertaining at times, and it gave him plenty of time to study for his diploma in even darker mathematics in the evenings, between episodes of House. That was the best bit about that place, their TV. Compared to the 4D network broadcasts back home, it was nothing more than a child's shadow play, of course. But the broadcasts had fascinated Effin completely, and he spent much of his spare time watching them. He was determined to spend a good portion of the leave he would take when this job was finished catching up on the 5 centuries of sci-fi he'd missed, which his old mate Nobrot had been recording for him back at the moon base. He loved Star Trek. It was his favourite. Those Klingon comedians. Fantastic. What an incredible thing those humans had created. Here they were, these tiny little bipeds stuck on a minuscule planet at the arse end of the cosmos, with absolutely no conception of the complexity of the universe at large, no idea what was going on just above the top of their atmosphere. So they had simply made it all up. Amazing. Completely inaccurate in every detail, of course, but still amazing. But now, for Effin, time was running short. If the Sol plan worked to schedule, and he could see no conceivable reason why it shouldn't, there were now less than 50 Earth years before there would be nothing left for Nobrot to record. Not much longer now, he said to himself as he sat in his pod unit wondering once again how the new Star Wars prequel that was being talked about when he left had turned out.